Hello and welcome to Mekelle Foresight. This is Mekelle producer and host of the show. With me today is Alex Duval, Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation and Research Professor at the Fletcher School of Global Affairs, Tufts University. Alex Duval, welcome to Mekelle Foresight.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. In this conversation, I would like us to look into the latest developments on the war on Tigray, with the focus on Eritrea. But before that, let me ask you, Alex Duval, about the information that's making the rounds on social media that Prime Minister Abiy is likely to announce unilateral ceasefire. This sounds familiar, doesn't it? Last time Abiy declared a unilateral ceasefire was when his forces were routed, with thousands of them captured last year and after they were pushed out of Tigray. Why do you think Abiy Ahmed's government might declare a unilateral ceasefire now?
Well, let us be clear that it is not possible to have a unilateral ceasefire. A ceasefire is a term of art used by military officers and specialists in conflict resolution and mediation that refers to okay, let me start that again because a call came in, which is...
Is it on me or on your...
On me, it's on me.
Okay. Okay.
Let us be clear, it is not possible to have a unilateral ceasefire. A ceasefire is a complicated operation that requires the consent and cooperation of both sides. It requires agreement on the disposition of military forces, on where they are located, and on some monitoring and verification mechanisms. What Abiy may want to call is that a unilateral cessation of hostilities. His forces will stop firing. However, given that a very substantial proportion of the Ethiopian National Defense Force is actually under the command of Eritrea, the second question that arises is, does that unilateral cessation of hostilities, does that include the Eritrean forces as well? And in order for this to be credible, viable, sustainable, it would be necessary for there to be a sustained negotiation with an international broker for full implementation and monitoring. Otherwise, it is just a public relations stunt intended to gain some credibility in the international community. It doesn't mean anything more than that.
Okay. So, in your article, The Despotism of Isaias, published on the 2nd of September, just recently, you write about Eritrea's role in the ongoing war on Tigray. The latest twist you write, I'm quoting, to Isaias' despotism is his effort to contrive a war between the federal government in Ethiopia and its antagonists in the region of Tigray. And talking of the recent flare-up, you also write the following. On the morning of September 1, the second round began. Eritrean artillery opened up huge barrage, firing at Tigrayan defenses, while Ethiopian conscripts readied for Isaias' signal to charge into battle. From these points, is it fair to say that, according to your assessment, Eritrea is the author of the ongoing war in northern Ethiopia and the one calling the shots in this war, both on the political and military levels?
I think it is the relationship between Isaias and Abiy is not clear. But let me make the following points. First of all, when the so-called humanitarian truce was agreed by both sides back in March, and then the talks began, we are told, towards a more substantial agreement between the Tigrayans and the federal government. The Eritreans were not involved in that process. There has been a general understanding that as part of the peace process, Eritrea has to withdraw. But until such time as Eritrea is not only withdrawn from Ethiopia and from Tigray especially, but also completely and verifiably out of the picture, there can be really no peace process between Tigray and Addis Ababa. And the reason for this is that however much Abiy might be committed to peace, and my own view is that his commitment is only tactical and opportunistic, it is not genuine and strategic. But even if he were genuinely committed to peace, he would not be able to achieve that peace without the consent and the cooperation of Isaias Afwerki. And for Isaias, the destruction of Tigray is a fundamental goal, and there's no sign that he has changed that goal. And the weakening and fragmentation of Ethiopia is a supplementary goal. It is something that he sees as highly desirable in pursuit of that goal. So until such time as the Eritrean factor is definitively removed from the equation, there could be no credible peace process. And yet Abiy did not deliver on that either because he didn't want it or because he couldn't. And then what we saw in the run-up to the outbreak of hostilities on the 24th of August was a mass mobilization to the war front, both the southern war front, but also the mobilization of Ethiopian troops into Eritrea. And it is not clear who is in charge here. But I think what we can say with some confidence is that Isaias Afwerki has been exercising a veto over any attempt to any possibility of resolving the war in Tigray. And until that veto is resolved, we have to say Isaias is at the minimum a co-equal actor along with Abiy in instigating the war. It's hard to say who really is driving this car, but if we would want to say that Abiy has his hands on the steering wheel, it is Isaias who is there in the instructor's seat with that emergency brake, who is able to either stop it or prevent it from stopping.
So what is at stake, though, in this round of war, and how will its outcome shape the political landscape in the region as a whole? You've written that for Isaias, this portends a final decision by force of arms. Would you please shed more light on that?
For Isaias, the destruction of Tigray is an existential issue. He knows that either he will prevail or Tigray will prevail. At the end of this war, one of them will be standing, not both. The international community does not seem to have appreciated that. They think that it's possible to rely on Isaias's word. I don't believe that is the case. So I think that when the guns started firing 2 days ago, with the assault on the northern front, on the Shararo-Badame front, what this portended was the final attempt by Isaias Afwerki to crush Tigray. Now, should he prevail, not only will he crush Tigray, but he will become the dominant factor, the key ruler, if you like, in the whole of the Horn of Africa. Not only will Ethiopia be under his heel, but he will be able to determine outcomes in Somalia and in Sudan. At least, at the very minimum, he will be able to veto attempts at peace and stability in those countries. So there's a great deal at stake. And one of the dilemmas, the challenges that faces the Tigrayan leadership in Mekelle today is that there will be international calls for a ceasefire, for stopping the fighting, leaving Isaias intact. And the calls for ending the fighting will be calibrated in such a way that the armies of Isaias and Abiy are left intact. And they, of course, will see this as a tactical setback, an opportunity, as last year, for them to regroup and fight another day. And they will, having failed in their military adventure, they will simply want to minimize the damage. And it puts the Tigrayan leadership in a very, very difficult situation, because if they pursue the war, then they will be the ones who are accused internationally of warmongering. But there is no easy solution to this without a really credible international peace process based on the correct analysis of the role of Eritrea in fomenting this disaster.
The other dilemma on the part of Tigray is there seems to be no clarity, at least in terms of pronouncing it, on the end goal, on the end goal of all this. So, what do you think lies? Where do you think lies Tigray's interest, and how will this ongoing war shape Tigray's destiny? I know there are references to self-determination, but that is broad term.
Well, there's another very short-term immediate factor that arises, which is the question of the siege, the blockade, the attempt to starve Tigray into submission. And the position of the TPLF, as Debretzion's made very clear in his letters to the international community, is that ending the starvation siege is not a matter for negotiation. It should be an unconditional commitment. However, at the moment, if you read the statements coming from Washington and from New York, everything should be negotiated. So essentially what the US and the UN are asking the TPLF to do is to negotiate over the ending of the starvation siege. And presumably what that means is that in return for lifting the blockade, not just providing food aid, but also lifting the blockade on banking, on medicine, etc., some concession should be extracted from Tigray. And that's a pretty tough one. And it will be interesting to see when the Security Council debates this matter on Thursday, where the United Nations and the international community comes out on that. Then we have the longer term factor of what is the political program that will be up for negotiation, that will be put on the table. And clearly, I think the Tigrayan leadership and the Tigrayan people will insist on no abrogation of the right of self-determination for the people of Tigray within the boundaries of Tigray as they existed prior to the outbreak of hostilities 22 months ago. Now, whether that is a precondition for negotiation or whether that is a negotiating stand, which they will go into negotiation to try to achieve, remains to be seen.
Regarding the siege starving of Tigray, I have seen a video of you making impassioned speech regarding the use of starvation as a weapon of war. You called out the UN institutions and the African Union for their failure to stand for basic humanity and for the principles they were founded for, and for their silence to stop starvation, for their appeasement of the perpetrators of injustice. Now, it sounds that this never again mantra we have heard repeatedly again and again after the Holocaust, after Rwanda and Srebrenica, are just hollow refrains, leading one observer to say, as if the international community likes to commemorate genocides. How do you explain this silence, this appeasement?
It's selective. It depends upon political calculus. So if you look specifically at the issue of starvation, what you will see is that the United States will condemn starvation crimes when it's a country they don't like that is committing it. So they will condemn Bashar al-Assad, they will condemn Vladimir Putin. They will be reluctant to condemn the Saudis and the Emiratis for the blockade of Yemen. And they will condemn South Sudan, not because they see South Sudan as an enemy, but because South Sudan doesn't have any weight in the international community, and therefore they can get away with a condemnation without any serious political cost. They seem to think or feel that there would be a political cost to condemning a policy of starvation conducted by Abiy Ahmed and Isaias in the case of Tigray. And so they are muting their criticism, and they are restricting their advocacy to the more narrow humanitarian issues without looking at the broader issues of blockade. And they are ready to condemn any action by TPLF, such as confiscating fuel from the World Food Programme, without condemning in outright terms the starvation blockade that has brought Tigray into its current impasse.
So I understand you're of the opinion that Isaias wants to see both the Ethiopian government and the Tigray weakened, and for Tigray, of course, as you said, it goes beyond that to eliminate it as a viable political entity once and for all. This is a fine line to tread. Don't you think so, Alex? As this may mean both getting weakened at the same time, it may not mean that. And it's also possible that the weakening of the Ethiopian government may translate into the strengthening of the Tigray forces that would then turn to take on Isaiah's army fully.
Well, what Isaias wants to do is to have Ethiopians kill one another. He wants, and in the early weeks of the war, it looked as though his ideal scenario was playing out. The TPLF was almost wiped out, and the Ethiopian National Defense Force was destroyed in the meantime as a workable institution. So he was getting his way, and he wants to see that happen again. And I suspect, I can't prove, but I suspect that he and also Abiy thought that the siege was working to the extent that Tigray was so weakened by hunger that the attack on Tigray would prevail. And so the TPLF would indeed be wiped out on this time round. Clearly, it's not going according to his plan.
Many believe what's happening in Tigray, all the atrocities have all the hallmarks of a genocide. Tigrayans are the target of annihilation, and the issue of intent is there. There are indications that the government is doing this deliberately. What's your take on this debate as to whether it should be catalogued as genocide?
I think if there's any case in the contemporary world where the term genocide is applicable, it would be Tigray. I think that if the State Department investigation into what was happening in Tigray, the report was completed 13 months ago. If that were to be unveiled, I think we would probably see the conclusion of the investigation is that there is a case to answer. As you say, the acts constitutive of genocide have been committed, and the intent is there, at least among some of the key perpetrators. That said, I think we shouldn't. We need to be careful, because if we fetishize the term genocide, we may end up misleading ourselves. There is no international obligation in law to intervene to stop genocide. There is an obligation to prevent it and to punish it, which has very occasionally been done. But the genocide is not, in international law, is not worse than crimes against humanity. The two are co-equal as the most terrible crimes on the book. So If you ask me, yes, I do think it is genocide. But I do warn that talking about genocide as though somehow getting an acceptance of genocide in the international community would make a huge difference. I don't think it will make a huge difference, sadly.
The global powers are vying for a presence in the Red Sea. This area is a major thoroughfare for world's maritime commerce. The U.S. seems to have thrown itself into this contest, against China, Russia, and the others. How is this playing out? And more importantly, how is it impacting peace in the region?
I think the two key factors there are the entry of the Gulf states into the peace and security landscape of the Horn of Africa. One of the key strategic goals under the EPRDF, especially when the late Meles Zenawi was in power, was to keep Egypt and the Gulf countries at arm's length. The nightmare scenario that Meles had was when you had Gulf countries with all their money pursuing an Egyptian agenda. And the national security strategy that was drawn up in 2001 identified the conquest of poverty in Ethiopia as the core strategic goal, precisely because it was only when Ethiopia developed and became middle income that it would be able to secure its economic and financial autonomy from the powers that were the strategic threat. Abiy Ahmed reversed that policy and embraced them. And I think that we're seeing the catastrophic results of that play out. And it was entirely foreseeable. And in fact, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs foresaw and objected to many of his actions back in even before the war broke out. The other key factor is Russia. So after the war in Ukraine, but even in the ramp up to the war, Russia was showing an interest in the Red Sea and trying to get a base in the Red Sea, and it was trying to get Sudan on side, and it succeeded in getting Eritrea on side. So that Eritrea is one of the few countries in the world that will speak up publicly in diplomatic fora in support of Russia. And it is interesting how this is playing out, because what this means is that Eritrea is becoming a national security issue for the United States. The US has made it clear to the countries of the region that an alliance with Eritrea is a national security concern for the US. However, what are the costs of this? Up to now, we haven't seen any action in public by the US in terms of sanctions or in terms of any sort of forms of leverage that the US has to punish countries that align themselves with Eritrea. And I think what we're going to see the big test of the coming days now is, will Abiy be paying a price for having got so closely into military alliance with Isaias? Or does the US continue to believe, in my view, mistakenly and naively, that somehow it can extract Abiy from the Eritrean grasp and get Ethiopia back on what it would see as a good and positive and American-friendly reformist path? I think that we have a moment of truth, and I remain unconvinced that the US has recognized quite the significance of this moment.
You portray Isaias as an old-fashioned despot who outlasted his most vigilant adversaries, expecting that in due course a new set of foreign leaders and diplomats would suffer amnesia. Seeing all the human rights violations against his own people and the atrocities he committed on the people of Tigray, his tactic of outweighting his regional adversaries and outwitting the West seems to have worked for him. Don't you agree?
I think it worked, and the question is, has he now run out of time? Has he overplayed his hand, particularly with regard to Russia and this latest offensive? Let's see. I hope that he has.
The process that was going on before the truce the humanitarian truce was broken. You said that you said is now dead, and that appeals for restraint will fall on deaf ears. What needs to happen for a genuine peace process to start?
I think the number one and number two factors are the definitive removal of Eritrea from the equation. Not promises, not bland assurances, oh, Eritreans will withdraw. We need a definitive removal of Eritrea with some robust, truly robust international guarantees. And if those guarantees aren't forthcoming, then there will be no end to this conflict. There may just be another lull before the fighting resumes. The second, I think, is there has to be a definitive guaranteed end to this starvation siege. And the situation after the humanitarian truce in March was that Abiy, the federal government, they still had that rope in their hands around the Tigrayan neck, and they could tighten it whenever they wanted. And I think what we've seen over the last few weeks is that it's not good enough to have their promises. It needs to be absolutely assured by a credible international process that the siege is over, definitively over, finished forever. Who can trust a leader who has gone back on his words so many times?
Regional peace and conflict analyst Rashid Abdi wrote today, and I quote, "I strongly favor peaceful resolution of conflict, but I am a realist. Ceasefire by one party that is not negotiated, not overseen by third parties, that stems from weakness, that is fundamentally insincere, cannot be sustainable." I think that also tallies well with what you said.
I completely agree. I think what we've seen in the past is tactical declarations of cessation of hostilities, pretending to be a ceasefire, that are just an excuse to reshuffle politically and regroup militarily, and this can't go
on. I have finished the questions that I wanted to ask, but maybe if you have some final thoughts, Alex Duval, the floor is yours.
I think this war, this conflict has just gone on too long. And I think that the astonishing resilience and the dignity under extreme pressure of the Tigrayan people is quite commendable, and I really hope that it gains the recognition and respect that it warrants.
Thank you very much, Alex Duval, for this very important reflections. Thank you for being our guest today.
Thank you very much.